To understand why the Griffith Park fire of October 3rd, 1933 turned so deadly, we have to look at the desperate conditions of the time. America was in the grip of the Great Depression, and Los Angeles was no exception. Jobs had vanished, and men from every background, clerks, teachers, ministers, and laborers were standing in breadlines. Relief programs offered a lifeline, giving counties federal funds to hire the unemployed for public works projects. The pay was meager, just 40 cents an hour, but in an era when families struggled to afford food, it meant survival. Griffith Park, the sprawling wilderness of rugged chaparral in the center of Los Angeles, became one of the city's largest work sites. Thousands of unemployed men were assigned to clear dry brush, cut fire breaks, and carve new roads through the steep hillsides. On the morning of October 3rd, more than 3,700 men were scattered throughout the park, divided into large squads of 50 to 80 workers, each supervised by a straw boss. These were not trained supervisors, and the workers were not firefighters. They were ordinary men trying to support their families during a time of despair. Journalists of the era described the men's cautious optimism, noting that after months of hopelessness, they finally had steady if exhausting work. The irony was that the same brittle brush they were paid to clear would soon feed a fire that turned the park into a death trap. This fragile setup, thousands of untrained laborers working in dangerous terrain under inexperienced leaders, created the conditions for disaster. The morning of October 3rd, 1933, seemed like any other workday inside Griffith Park. The sun was unrelenting, the air was bone dry, and the Santa Ana winds carried the scent of dust and heat. Crews hacked away at brittle brush with shovels, hoes, and pickaxes, their clothing soaked through with sweat. No one realized that the same conditions fueling their exhaustion were also laying the groundwork for catastrophe. Shortly after noon, smoke began curling upward from a ravine near the mineral wells area of the park. Some accounts suggested that sparks from a worker's cooking fire might have escaped, while others pointed to smoldering embers left from a trash burn earlier that morning. Whatever the cause, the timing was disastrous. The winds turned what could have been a minor blaze into a wall of flame racing across the hillsides. The fire leapt from one slope to another, climbing ridges in seconds and choking the canyons with smoke. Untrained men with little more than shovels and blankets tried to stamp it out, but that they were no match for a wildfire feeding on acres of dry chaparral. Supervisors shouted contradictory orders, and panic spread as the fire split into several fast-moving fronts. Instead of evacuating, many of the crews were ordered to fight the flames head-on, placing them directly in harm's way. This moment, the spark combined with confusion and poor decisions, was the turning point. What could have been a small, contained fire now became a fast-moving disaster. Thousands of men found themselves trapped on rugged slopes with no escape routes. Facing an inferno, they had no training to fight. The stage was now set for one of the deadliest workplace disasters Los Angeles had ever seen. By early afternoon, the fire had grown into a monster no one could control. What began as a single column of smoke now spread into multiple fronts, each one pushed by strong Santa Ana winds that howled through the canyons. The men working the slopes had no fire-resistant clothing, no protective gear, and no water hoses. Their only tools were shovels, picks, and blankets, laughably inadequate against walls of fire stretching dozens of feet high. As the flames roared downhill, workers became disoriented in the smoke and confusion. Some ran toward what they thought was safety, only to find themselves surrounded as the fire circled back with terrifying speed. Others tried to climb the ridges, but the steep terrain and thick brush slowed them down. The heat was so intense that it dried out lungs with every breath, leaving men gasping and collapsing on the slopes. Supervisors shouted for workers to hold their ground and dig fire breaks, but those breaks crumbled in minutes as sparks leapt over them. In the chaos, men were caught in ravines that acted like chimneys, funneling flames straight over their heads. Some scrambled into dry creek beds, only to be smothered by falling embers and thick smoke. The lack of any organized escape plan meant survival depended on chance, on which way the wind turned, or which canyon they chose to flee. By the time the fire had raged for just a few short hours, Griffith Park was unrecognizable. Hillsides that had been alive with brush and trees were reduced to blackened skeletons. Scattered across the terrain were the tools of labor, shovels, pickaxes, and half-burned work gloves, evidence of a workforce overwhelmed by a force of nature they never had a chance to fight. The inferno had trapped them, and the worst was still yet to come. When the flames finally died down, the scale of the tragedy began to reveal itself. Dozens of men had been killed, many of them trapped in gullies or overcome by the choking smoke. Their bodies were discovered scattered across the hillsides, a grim reminder of just how unprepared they had been. In a single afternoon, one of the largest urban parks in the nation had become a graveyard. Los Angeles awoke the next day to headlines that stunned the city. The death toll climbed with each new report, making it the deadliest wildfire in California history at the time. Families rushed to hospitals and makeshift morgues, searching for loved ones who had not returned home from work. Most of the victims had been day laborers, men with little choice but to take dangerous jobs in the depths of the Great Depression. The devastation extended beyond the human cost. Hillsides once covered in lush chaparral were stripped bare, leaving the park vulnerable to erosion and flooding in the months to come. The blackened landscape stood in stark contrast to the clear skies above, a reminder that nature's fury could wipe out decades of growth in just hours. The damage was not only physical but psychological, shaking the city's faith in its ability to protect its workers and its land. What made this disaster even more haunting was how preventable it might have been. There had been no safety training, no fire crews stationed nearby, and no system to evacuate workers quickly. The tragedy exposed a dangerous gap between the city's ambitions and its preparedness. As news spread across the country, it was no longer just a local story. It became a symbol of what could happen when human labor collided with unchecked natural disaster. In the weeks after the fire, the city of Los Angeles launched a series of investigations to understand how such devastation could happen in just a single afternoon. Officials quickly discovered that there had been almost no planning for a disaster of this scale. Workers had been sent into the flames with shovels and branches, tools that stood no chance against a fast-moving wildfire. Questions began to surface about why proper firefighting crews had not been on hand when thousands of men were laboring in one of the driest, most fire-prone parks in the region. The inquiry revealed that the victims had not been city employees, but day laborers, hired through relief programs. This meant they had virtually no training, no protective gear, and no rights to demand safer conditions. Their desperation for wages in the depths of the Great Depression left them vulnerable, and in Griffith Park, that vulnerability turned deadly. What made the situation worse was that supervisors reportedly gave conflicting orders, leaving men trapped when the fire shifted direction. Witnesses described chaos on the hillsides, some groups told to dig fire breaks, others ordered to flee, and still others left with no instructions at all. By the time organized firefighting units arrived, the flames had already swept through the canyons where the laborers worked. The investigations painted a picture of confusion, negligence, and a city unprepared for the risks it had created. For the families of the victims, the findings offered little comfort. Though officials promised reforms and safety improvements, no one was ever held directly accountable for the lives lost. The tragedy was labeled an accident, and the men who died were remembered more as statistics than as individuals. The investigations showed the public that this was not just a natural disaster, it was also the product of human failure. And that realization set the stage for the heated debates that would follow in the years to come. The Griffith Park fire of 1933 left scars that reached far beyond the canyons where the flames burned. It exposed how quickly desperation, poor planning, and mismanagement can turn a local blaze into one of the deadliest workplace disasters in California history. For the city of Los Angeles, the fire became a sobering lesson in the cost of ignoring safety when human lives are at stake. Relief programs across the country were forced to reconsider how they deployed untrained labor, especially in hazardous conditions. In the years that followed, new policies slowly emerged, demanding better oversight and more professional firefighting standards. Training equipment and safety procedures were strengthened, though these changes came far too late for the men who had perished on that October day. Even so, Griffith Park's tragedy became a turning point, reminding communities that wildfires were not just natural events, but disasters shaped by human decisions. From a modern perspective, the fire serves as a warning of what can happen when economic hardship collides with dangerous work. It shows how vulnerable societies can be when people are forced into peril for survival, and how easily leaders can underestimate risks in pursuit of short-term goals. As cities continue to expand into fire-prone landscapes, the same choices and mistakes made in 1933 still loom as possibilities. The legacy of Griffith Park is not only about flames and smoke, it is about accountability, The workers who died were casualties of more than fire. They were victims of neglect, desperation, in a city unprepared for disaster. Their story stands as both a memorial and a cautionary tale. If history repeats itself, the consequences could be just as deadly, and that is what makes the Griffith Park fire of 1933 a haunting reminder of the thin line between survival and catastrophe. The first 60 minutes after Asia goes dark are defined by shock and paralysis. Across a landmass that holds nearly 60% of the global population, every city, town, and rural village is silenced in an instant. The electric heartbeat of Tokyo, Seoul, Shanghai, Delhi, and Singapore stops at the same moment, plunging nearly 4.9 billion people into darkness. It is not a rolling blackout or a regional failure. This is the largest power loss in human history. Transportation is the first system to seize up. In megacities, fully automated subway trains stall in tunnels, leaving commuters trapped with no way to escape without assistance. Above ground, traffic signals blink out, causing collisions in intersections as drivers try to navigate the sudden void. Air traffic control centers across Asia are blinded, and pilots flying over some of the most congested skies on Earth are left to rely only on cockpit instruments and their own training. The busiest air corridors in the world are now scenes of confusion with no coordinated direction. Hospitals are next to feel the impact. By regulation, many major medical centers are equipped with backup generators, but these are designed for short-term emergencies, not for an outage across an entire continent. Ventilators, dialysis machines, and life support systems begin to draw down battery reserves. Surgeons caught in the middle of critical operations are forced to improvise under flashlights. Within the first hour, lives are already at risk, and the most vulnerable patients feel the immediate consequences. Communication breaks down just as quickly. Cell towers have a limited backup power, but the sudden demand overwhelms networks. Landline systems, which depend on powered exchanges, also fail. The internet, built on a dense mesh of servers, data centers, and undersea cables, flickers into silence from the eastern seaboard of Russia to the island nations of Southeast Asia. Families lose contact with one another. Governments cannot issue instructions. Emergency responders cannot coordinate rescues. For billions of people, the world suddenly contracts to the radius of their own neighborhood. Rumors spread in place of news. Streets fill with worried residents who stare into a sky that should be glowing with city lights but is now pitch black. The silence is unlike anything they have ever experienced. No hum of machinery, no electronic noise. Only the growing sound of voices filled with confusion and fear. In this moment, Asia has not just lost its power, it has lost its sense of stability. As the first rays of daylight sweep across Asia, the enormity of the crisis becomes impossible to ignore. Overnight, confusion transforms into full awareness. The largest continent on Earth has been completely unplugged. In cities like New Delhi, Manila, and Kuala Lumpur, water taps fall silent. Municipal pumps, dependent on constant electricity, can no longer push water through the vast networks of pipes. Families in high-rise apartments quickly realize that their homes, once connected to reliable utilities, have become isolated shells. Buckets and bottles are carried down stairwells as residents search for nearby wells or rivers. Sanitation begins to deteriorate just as quickly. Modern sewage treatment systems, which rely on continuous pumping and aeration, are at a standstill. Wastewater overflows threaten to seep into drinking supplies, creating the perfect conditions for outbreaks of waterborne diseases. The lessons learned in past disasters, from typhoons to earthquakes, show how rapidly cholera, dysentery, and other illnesses can re-emerge when sanitation fails. Food stability, too, is unraveling. Without refrigeration, millions of tons of stored meat, dairy, and vegetables begin to spoil. Large distribution centers that supply grocery stores in Seoul, Bangkok, and Ho Chi Minh City are filled with perishable goods now locked in a race against time. Fishermen and farmers, suddenly cut off from cold storage and transport, face the prospect of losing their livelihoods overnight. The social consequences begin to surface. In urban neighborhoods, people crowd into open markets, desperate to secure whatever food remains fresh. Some merchants raise prices as supplies dwindle, while others simply shut their stalls to avoid chaos. Law enforcement, hobbled by their inability to coordinate or communicate, struggles to maintain calm. Isolated patrols walk the streets, but without functioning radios or vehicles, their reach is limited, and the atmosphere is not yet outright panic, but the strain is visible everywhere. Families huddle on rooftops and in courtyards, whispering rumors and speculating about what has happened. For the first time, many realize this blackout is not a local issue, nor even a national one. It spans an entire continent. The thin fabric of order that holds the modern city together has been stretched to its breaking point, and with each passing hour, the world edges closer to unraveling. By the 12th hour, the crisis in Asia has already spilled far beyond its borders. The world's financial networks, built on constant communication and digital transactions, feel the shock in real time. In Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Shanghai, stock exchanges remain dark. Without even the possibility of opening, global investors are left staring at blank screens. Asia represents more than half of the planet's economic output, and its sudden silence sends ripples across the interconnected system. In Europe, the markets in Frankfurt and London begin the day in freefall. Automated trading systems designed to react instantly to volatility struggle to process an event that has no precedent: the disappearance of billions of consumers and the shutdown of entire manufacturing hubs. Within minutes, billions of dollars in value vanish, triggering waves of margin calls and forced liquidations. Energy markets feel the shock as well. Asia is the largest importer of crude oil, natural gas, and coal. Tankers bound for Chinese and Indian ports are suddenly without destinations. Prices swing wildly, initially plummeting due to the loss of demand, then spiking as traders realize that without Asia's refineries and factories, the global balance of energy production and consumption has collapsed. Shipping and logistics are paralyzed. The ports of Singapore, Shanghai, and Busan normally handle a massive share of the world's container traffic. With them frozen, insurance companies halt coverage on vessels headed into Asian waters. Shipments of electronics, textiles, and machine parts are stranded at sea, unable to unload. Even companies thousands of miles away in South America or Africa feel the disruption within hours as cargo contracts are voided and delivery schedules collapse. Banks in New York and London scramble to protect themselves, but with Asia's financial institutions disconnected, the chain of debt and credit grinds to a halt. Currency markets swing violently as investors flee from Asian currencies, which can no longer be traded reliably. The dollar and the euro surge in strength, but even that stability is an illusion. Without Asia's participation, the system itself is breaking. The financial world has experienced crashes before: the Great Depression, the global crisis of 2008, but never a disappearance of this magnitude. In half a day, the blackout in Asia has mutated into a global contagion. By the time Wall Street's opening bell rings, it is clear this is not a regional disaster, it is the first domino in a collapse that threatens the very foundation of the modern economy. At the 24-hour mark, the consequences of Asia's blackout extend from financial markets into the physical backbone of the global economy. The most immediate fracture comes in the supply chain, the invisible system that keeps factories running and store shelves full. Modern manufacturing depends on components that move across borders daily. Nowhere is this clearer than in the electronics sector. Taiwan produces more than half of the world's advanced semiconductors, chips that power everything from smartphones to cars. With its fabrication plants offline, assembly lines in Europe, North America, and beyond begin shutting down within hours. The automotive industry is next. Japanese and South Korean factories supply critical parts such as transmissions, batteries, and specialized steel. Without them, plants in Mexico, Germany, and the United States are forced to idle. A car today can require over 30,000 individual components, and if even one is missing, the line grinds to a halt. Pharmaceutical supply chains face the same fate. India and China together manufacture the majority of the world's generic medicines and key active pharmaceutical ingredients. Hospitals outside Asia suddenly find their inventories dwindling. Treatments for conditions such as hypertension, infection, and diabetes begin slipping into shortage, threatening lives far beyond the blackout zone. Global shipping tells a similar story. The port of Shanghai alone normally handles more than 40 million containers each year, making it the busiest in the world. With it and other Asian hubs like Singapore silent, shipping companies scramble to reroute vessels, but few alternatives exist at the same scale. Thousands of ships sit stranded, their cargo unable to reach markets. Air cargo is equally paralyzed. Major hubs in Hong Kong, Incheon, and Beijing together process millions of tons of goods annually. With these airports inoperable, everything from fresh produce to critical electronics, components cannot move, perishable goods spoil on tarmacs, and global retailers brace for empty shelves. By the end of the first day, the realization sets in. The blackout is not just a regional power failure, it has severed the arteries of global trade. The world has spent decades building a system where every region depends on Asia's factories, ports, and resources. In one day, that system has been switched off. After 7 days in total darkness, the disaster inside Asia has shifted from economic paralysis to a profound humanitarian emergency for nearly 4.9 billion people. Survival itself is now the central struggle. Food reserves in homes and shops are nearly gone. Without refrigeration, much of the stored food supply spoiled within the first few days. In countries such as India, China, and Indonesia, where hundreds of millions rely on daily markets rather than long-term storage, the shortages are immediate and severe. Urban centers, dependent on constant resupply, begin experiencing hunger riots as desperation overtakes order. Water is just as critical. Municipal pumps, which rely entirely on electricity, have now been dry for a week. In cities like Manila, Karachi, and Dhaka, families wait in endless lines for a chance to collect water from wells or rivers. Without proper sanitation systems running, those same rivers become contaminated, accelerating the spread of diseases such as cholera and dysentery. Healthcare collapses even further. Patients requiring refrigerated medicines like insulin or blood products are among the first casualties. Dialysis clinics, which depend on both clean water and reliable electricity, are forced to close, putting millions of lives at immediate risk. Vaccines, many of which must be stored cold, have already spoiled, leaving populations vulnerable to outbreaks. Rural areas suffer differently. In parts of South and Southeast Asia, irrigation systems powered by electricity no longer function. Crops that depend on pumps for water begin to fail, raising the specter of famine in the coming months. Farmers are unable to transport what food they do harvest, as fuel distribution networks also rely on electricity to operate. Governments attempt to maintain control, but with communication systems down, coordination is almost impossible. In some regions, the military is deployed to maintain order, yet even soldiers face the same shortages of food, fuel, and medicine. Social unrest grows, with the communities turning inward, relying on local networks rather than national leadership. Outside Asia, the international community struggles with the scale of the crisis. Delivering aid to nearly 5 billion people is an almost unimaginable challenge. Ports and airports remain frozen by the blackout, preventing mass shipments of food or medicine. Neighboring regions from the Middle East to Europe begin seeing waves of refugees attempting to cross borders in search of survival. At the 1 week point, the blackout is no longer just a technological failure. It is a humanitarian disaster of historic proportions, threatening to reshape not only Asia, but the entire global order. After 1 month without electricity, Asia has been transformed beyond recognition. Cities that once pulsed with life are now quiet. Broken landscapes where survival is the only priority. The absence of power is no longer seen as temporary. It has become the defining reality for nearly 5 billion people. The physical infrastructure of the power grid is in ruins. An abrupt continent-wide shutdown would cause cascading damage to transmission lines, substations, and generating stations. Restarting them requires not only technical expertise, but also complex coordination across national borders, which is now impossible. Even if the blackout ended tomorrow, rebuilding would take years, if not decades. The human toll mounts every day. Malnutrition spreads quickly as agricultural systems collapse, without irrigation, fertilizer production, and refrigerated transport. Famine becomes widespread in nations like Bangladesh and Cambodia, where food security was fragile even before the disaster. Disease outbreaks multiply in dense cities, with measles and tuberculosis re-emerging as vaccines and antibiotics run out. Mortality rises sharply, leaving entire regions without the skilled workers needed to keep even basic systems functioning. Outside of Asia, the rest of the world is deeply scarred. Supply chains have permanently broken. Factories in Europe and North America lie idle, waiting for parts that will never arrive. The global electronics sector has collapsed, with Taiwan, South Korea, and China offline. Even medicine production in the West falters without critical components sourced from India. What once was a tightly interwoven global economy is now fragmented into regional survival zones. Governments worldwide respond by tightening control. Rationing is enforced on food, fuel, and medicine. In some nations, martial law is declared to quell unrest. Old alliances weaken as countries prioritize domestic survival over international cooperation. A new era of protectionism takes root, where self-sufficiency replaces globalization as the highest priority. And for Asia itself, the long-term outlook is bleak. Generations of progress in healthcare, education, and industry are erased in weeks. Entire populations are displaced as rural families abandon failing farmland, and cities empty out from starvation. Social structures fracture, replaced by small, localized communities that depend on direct resource sharing. Modernity, with its reliance on a complex and fragile energy grid, has vanished almost overnight. The event becomes a dividing line in human history. Life is now spoken of as before the blackout and after the blackout. The memory of a connected, electrified world lingers, but the lived reality is one of scarcity, struggle, and rebuilding from the ground up. Humanity learns the hard truth: civilization is only as strong as the systems that power it, and without them, the world quickly unravels. The great darkness across Asia serves as a stark reminder. In our pursuit of growth and efficiency, we may have created a system too vast and too interconnected to survive a single catastrophic failure. And the question left behind is one that will haunt humanity for generations. If such a collapse ever came for the rest of the world, would we be any more prepared to endure it? By the year 2075, the map of our world could look very different, not because of wars or political change, but because of water and heat reshaping the places we call home. Entire regions, now bustling with life, may face a future where living there becomes nearly impossible. This isn't a vague warning, it's a pressing timeline. And for millions, that deadline is coming far sooner than expected. From rising seas to extreme heat waves, the planet is quietly sending signals that some of its most populated and productive areas could become unlivable. Human civilization has thrived within a surprisingly narrow climate niche for thousands of years. Think of it as our species' Goldilocks zone, conditions that are just right for survival and productivity. But according to a major study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, if greenhouse gas emissions continue on their current path, huge portions of the planet could be pushed outside this safe zone within the next 50 years. This forecast isn't speculation, it's grounded in data from NASA, the United Nations, and multiple climate research institutions. The two main drivers of this transformation are rising temperatures and encroaching waters. Some regions will face deadly heat, making human survival extremely difficult, while others may literally be swallowed by the sea. Today we'll be counting down 10 regions where these changes could make life nearly impossible, starting with areas that may seem surprising, and moving to those facing the most extreme threats. From shrinking islands to sweltering plains, this is a look at the places most at risk in the next half century. Let's start with a place you might not immediately think of when imagining climate danger: the United Kingdom. While it won't turn into a desert, its greatest vulnerability lies in the very waters that surround it. Rising seas pose a serious threat to England and Wales, where coastal defenses may struggle to keep pace. By 2075, projections indicate that even a sea level rise of just 0.35 meters could increase the frequency and height of water overtopping seawalls by as much as 50 to 150%. Right now, roughly 17% of the UK's coastline is already eroding, and in some areas, 28% of the coast loses more than 10 centimeters of land each year. Iconic cliffs and seaside communities could face dramatic changes, with entire villages at risk of being washed away. This is a hypothetical but plausible scenario, based on current trends and scientific modeling. If nothing changes, storms and high tides could combine with rising sea levels to transform these familiar coastal landscapes, creating a future where some areas may be increasingly difficult or even impossible to inhabit safely. Crossing the Atlantic, the outlook becomes even more serious along the southern coast of the United States. Cities like New Orleans and Miami face a double threat from rising seas and the gradual sinking of land in some areas. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, projects that sea levels along U.S. coastlines could rise by 10 to 12 inches by 2050, which is just 25 years from now. That might sound small, but even a rise of that scale could transform minor flooding events into frequent disruptive hazards. Areas that once only flooded during extreme storms could see water spilling over roads and into homes on a monthly basis. Miami in particular struggles because its porous limestone foundation allows seawater to seep inland, affecting freshwater supplies and destabilizing infrastructure. This combination of rising water and sinking land could turn once thriving communities into zones that are increasingly difficult to live in safely. In this hypothetical scenario, Routine daily life might involve constant preparation for floods, with some neighborhoods becoming all but uninhabitable. While adaptive measures like seawalls and pumps can help, the sheer scale of the threat underscores how quickly familiar landscapes could change under relentless pressure from climate-driven sea level rise. Moving to Southeast Asia, the Mekong Delta faces one of the most serious water-related crises in the world. This fertile region, home to tens of millions of people, sits barely a meter above sea level in many areas. By 2075, rising seas combined with land subsidence, caused by groundwater pumping and upstream dams, could submerge large parts of the delta. Ho Chi Minh City, the economic heart of southern Vietnam, already contends with regular flooding, and the problem is projected to worsen dramatically. Vast areas of rice paddies and urban neighborhoods could be underwater, threatening food security and displacing millions of residents. Scientists warn that without massive intervention, the delta's land area could shrink significantly, creating one of the largest climate-driven migration crises in human history. In this hypothetical disaster scenario, communities would face both temporary and permanent displacement, while essential infrastructure, including roads and bridges, would be repeatedly damaged by floodwaters. The combination of rising seas, sinking land, and disrupted river flow illustrates how quickly a densely populated region can approach uninhabitability if current trends continue. Next, we head to the Maldives, a nation famous for its turquoise waters and coral atolls. This archipelago is the lowest lying country on Earth, with more than 80% of its islands less than a meter above sea level. By 2075, rising seas could make large portions of the Maldives uninhabitable, contaminating freshwater sources and flooding homes, roads, and airports. Scientists warn that even small increases in sea level can have catastrophic consequences for this nation, where life is concentrated entirely on narrow strips of land. In a hypothetical disaster scenario, entire communities could be forced to relocate, and traditional ways of life, including fishing and local trade, could collapse. The government is exploring radical solutions like floating cities or massive seawalls, but such measures may only delay the inevitable. Tourists, who make up a large portion of the economy, could also decline sharply, impacting income and livelihoods. The Maldives serves as a stark example of how rising seas threaten national survival, not just property, in the coming decades. Shifting from water to heat, eastern China faces a different kind of threat. This densely populated region, home to hundreds of millions of people, could experience extreme temperature spikes by 2070. NASA climate models predict that heat waves could reach lethal wet bulb temperatures, where the combination of heat and humidity overwhelms the human body's ability to cool itself through sweating. A wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, or 95 degrees Fahrenheit, is considered deadly if exposure lasts more than 6 hours. Cities such as Shanghai and Nanjing could see these extreme conditions on multiple days during peak summer months, making outdoor work dangerous and stressing energy systems. The intense heat could also disrupt agriculture, affecting food supply both locally and nationally. In this hypothetical scenario, millions might face reduced livability without massive technological adaptation, such as air conditioning or cooling shelters. Eastern China highlights how climate-driven heat, not just sea level rise, can render vast regions increasingly uninhabitable in the coming decades. Moving across the globe, northern South America, including parts of Brazil and Venezuela, faces an extreme heat challenge. By 2070, climate projections suggest this region could experience average temperatures similar to today's Sahara Desert. This is not just uncomfortable, it is dangerously outside the human climate niche where our species can safely live without technological aid. High humidity combined with soaring temperatures would make outdoor work nearly impossible and put enormous strain on power grids, water supplies, and public health systems. Cities like Manaus and Caracas could experience heat waves that regularly exceed the 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb threshold, putting residents at risk even with modern infrastructure. Agriculture could collapse in vulnerable areas, threatening local and global food security. Without major adaptation efforts, millions of people might be forced to relocate, creating one of the first large-scale, climate-driven migrations in the 21st century. Northern South America serves as a stark reminder that heat, not just rising seas, can make once thriving regions nearly unlivable. Shifting to the heart of a continent, Central Africa is facing a combination of population growth and extreme heat that could push it toward uninhabitability by 2070. Countries such as Nigeria, Cameroon, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo are projected to experience soaring temperatures that fall well outside the safe range for human survival without modern cooling technology. Rapid population growth intensifies the problem, placing more people in regions where extreme heat could make daily life hazardous. For every 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature, studies estimate that roughly 1 billion people worldwide could face conditions close to unlivable, and Central Africa is particularly vulnerable. Agriculture, water access, and energy infrastructure would all face unprecedented stress, potentially triggering regional instability and food insecurity. Heat waves could become frequent, and even well-adapted urban centers may struggle to protect residents without massive investment in climate-resilient infrastructure. This region highlights how a lethal combination of climate and demographic pressures could create some of the world's first truly uninhabitable zones. Central Africa is a clear example that human survival depends on adaptation as much as geography. Moving to one of the hottest regions on Earth, the nations surrounding the Red Sea and Persian Gulf are projected to face extreme, potentially deadly heat by 2070. Cities such as Dubai, Doha, and Riyadh could regularly experience wet bulb temperatures exceeding 35 degrees Celsius, a threshold beyond which the human body cannot effectively cool itself through sweating. Even wealthy, air-conditioned cities would struggle to maintain safety outdoors during these peak heat events. This region combines high temperatures with high humidity, creating conditions that are exceptionally difficult for humans to endure. Outdoor work, traditional practices, and even daily activities could become life-threatening without technological support. Prolonged exposure during the hottest months might force societies to adapt by dramatically shifting schedules, relying on artificial cooling, or limiting outdoor activity. The Red Sea and Persian Gulf exemplify how climate extremes, even in economically advanced areas, could challenge habitability. These harsh conditions could make this region one of the earliest global hotspots where humans struggle to survive outside controlled environments. Next, we travel to the vast landscapes of northern Australia, a region already known for its harsh climate. By 2070, projections suggest that large portions of the Northern Territory and Queensland could face extreme heat that pushes well beyond the climate range humans have adapted to over millennia. Average summer temperatures could rival those of the Sahara, making outdoor work nearly impossible without significant technological support. Even though Australia is a developed nation with modern infrastructure, the intensity of this heat would put enormous stress on communities, agriculture, and energy systems. Farming, mining, and other essential industries that rely on outdoor labor could see productivity collapse during extreme heat periods. Ecosystems would also feel the pressure, with water sources drying faster and wildlife struggling to survive in increasingly hot conditions. Northern Australia serves as a stark example of how climate extremes could threaten habitability in parts of the developed world, not just in poorer nations. At the top of our countdown is the densely populated plains of South Asia, spanning parts of India and Pakistan. By 2070, climate models project that this region could regularly surpass the 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature threshold during heat waves. This is the point where heat and humidity combine to make it impossible for the human body to cool itself through sweating, putting hundreds of millions of people at serious risk. The sheer density of the population in this region amplifies the challenge. Many communities rely on outdoor labor for agriculture, trade, and daily survival, making exposure to extreme heat unavoidable. Water scarcity is expected to worsen, and energy systems may struggle to meet the rising demand for cooling. In a worst-case high emissions scenario, nearly a third of the global population could face conditions outside the human climate niche by 2070, with India and Pakistan being among the hardest hit. South Asia represents the ultimate convergence of population, heat, and humidity, making it arguably the most urgent case for adaptation and mitigation strategies. While life will continue, the scale of the challenge underscores just how dramatically climate change could redraw the map of habitable regions. It is a sobering reminder that the clock is ticking, and the actions we take today will determine the habitability of these regions for generations to come. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, known widely as GERD, is not just a piece of infrastructure. It is a symbol of Ethiopia's ambitions. Rising from the Benishangul Gumuz region near the Blue Nile, the project has been described as the crown jewel of the country's development. Construction began in the year 2011 and, After more than a decade of work, Ethiopia officially inaugurated the dam in September of 2025. It stands nearly 170 meters tall and stretches close to 2 kilometers across, making it the largest hydroelectric power plant on the African continent. What makes the GERD unique is not only its size, but how it was funded. Unlike many large infrastructure projects that rely on international loans, the Renaissance Dam was largely financed through contributions from Ethiopian citizens, bonds, and state revenues. This gave it the weight of a national project, seen as a matter of sovereignty and pride. For Ethiopia, the dam is meant to double the nation's electricity production, supply power to millions who have lived without reliable energy, and even allow exports of electricity to neighboring countries. Behind its concrete walls lies a vast reservoir with a capacity of about 74 billion cubic meters of water. To put that in perspective, it is a man-made lake large enough to cover an area bigger than the entire city of London. For Ethiopia, that reservoir represents stored energy, economic opportunity, and a chance to lift millions out of poverty. But downstream in Sudan and Egypt, the same body of water is viewed with deep unease. The Nile is more than just a river to those countries, it is their lifeline. Egypt, home to over 100 million people, depends on the Nile for more than 90% of its fresh water. Sudan relies on it for agriculture and survival as well. To both nations, the GERD carries the possibility of altering the flow of this ancient river. And while diplomatic disputes over water rights and old colonial-era treaties have dominated headlines, an even darker possibility lurks behind it all. If the dam were ever to fail, whether through accident, natural disaster, or even sabotage, the consequences would unfold on a scale almost too vast to imagine. This is the hidden danger of the Renaissance Dam, a project built as a promise of progress, but shadowed by the risk of catastrophe. And in the scenario we are exploring, that shadow becomes reality. It begins without warning. In this hypothetical scenario, the towering wall of the grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam suddenly gives way. Concrete fractures, water roars, and 74 billion cubic meters of stored Nile water surge forward with unstoppable force. Within seconds, what had been a calm reservoir transforms into a tidal wave of destruction. The energy released is equal to several nuclear bombs, but instead of fire and smoke, it is water and chaos. The first to feel the impact would be the communities closest to the dam site. Entire villages along the Blue Nile would be swept away before a single warning could be sounded. Roads, bridges, and farmland would vanish beneath walls of water, moving faster than a person could run. The shockwave would obliterate power lines and communication systems, leaving survivors cut off in the dark. As the flood races downstream, Sudan becomes the next victim. Towns and cities built along the Nile would be overwhelmed within hours. The capital, Khartoum, sitting at the confluence of the Blue and White Nile, would face one of the worst urban floods in modern history. Buildings would collapse, infrastructure would fail, and millions would be forced to flee with nowhere to go. Beyond Sudan, the wave of destruction would continue its march northward toward Egypt. The Nile, usually steady and life-giving, would turn into a raging torrent. Fields that once grew wheat and vegetables would be drowned, villages buried in mud, and ancient sites along the river damaged beyond repair. Even the massive Aswan High Dam could be placed under strain, tested as never before. In only a matter of hours, the entire course of the Nile, from Ethiopia to Egypt, would be transformed. What had once been the foundation of civilizations for thousands of years would become a corridor of devastation, and yet this would only be the beginning. The breach itself is just the spark. What follows are the long-term consequences that no nation could fully prepare for. In this hypothetical disaster, the true devastation is measured not just in collapsed bridges and flooded farmland, but in the lives upended. Millions of people across Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt depend directly on the Nile for water, food, and survival. When the dam breaks, their homes, villages, and entire communities would be swept away in hours. Families would be scattered, with countless forced to flee toward higher ground carrying only what they could grab in moments of chaos. Sudan would likely face the greatest immediate displacement. Cities like Khartoum and Omdurman could see hundreds of thousands of residents stranded, with roads cut off and supply chains severed. Hospitals would be overwhelmed within days, not only by injuries from the flood, but by outbreaks of water-borne disease spreading through polluted floodwaters. Drinking water supplies would collapse, forcing survivors to rely on unsafe sources that increase the risk of cholera and other deadly illnesses. In Egypt, the crisis would play out differently, but with no less urgency. The Nile supports nearly the entire population of the country, and sudden disruption to its flow would cripple water distribution networks. Crops vital for daily food supplies would be destroyed, leaving millions at risk of hunger. Refugee flows from Sudan would surge northward, creating political and humanitarian strain on a nation already managing high population density. Beyond the immediate region, the human cost would spill across borders. International aid organizations would struggle to deliver assistance as destroyed infrastructure blocks entry into the hardest hit zones. Camps would form rapidly, but overcrowding and lack of sanitation would add to the suffering. The sheer scale of the crisis would push global relief systems to their limits. This wave of human suffering highlights the reality that a dam break is never only about physical destruction. It is about destabilizing entire societies, leaving millions without security, shelter, or hope. And as the survivors fight for survival in the aftermath, the political and economic consequences of this catastrophe would soon come into focus. As the floodwaters recede, the hypothetical disaster would shift from an environmental and humanitarian catastrophe to an intense political crisis. Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt have long-standing fragile agreements over Nile water usage, and the dam's failure would instantly shatter decades of negotiation. Ethiopia would face international scrutiny and anger for what is perceived as negligence, even if the breach was caused by natural factors beyond human control. Regional stability would be at risk, with neighbors demanding accountability and reparations for the unprecedented loss of life and property. Sudan, reeling from the destruction of the Gezira Plain and the collapse of downstream dams, would confront political turmoil. The government would struggle to maintain control as millions of displaced citizens compete for dwindling resources. Local authorities in Khartoum and other major cities would face immense pressure to provide shelter, food, and security, all while attempting to prevent civil unrest. Egypt's reliance on the Nile for over 90% of its freshwater would place the country in an extremely vulnerable position. The emergency releases from the Aswan High Dam, intended to prevent its own collapse, would lead to widespread flooding along the Nile Valley. Agricultural regions, some of the most fertile in the world, would be devastated, triggering food shortages and threatening the livelihoods of millions of farmers. Diplomatic relations with Ethiopia would reach a breaking point, as the Egyptian government demands international intervention and compensation. International organizations would be drawn into the crisis. The United Nations, the African Union, and humanitarian agencies would scramble to coordinate relief, mediate disputes, and deliver aid across borders. The global community would be forced to confront the cascading effects of infrastructure failure on diplomacy, regional security, and economic stability. Ultimately, the political fallout of a Gay-Erd breach would rival the physical devastation. Governments would be under immense pressure from both domestic populations and international observers. The failure of a single engineering project could redefine the balance of power in Northeast Africa, leaving nations politically fractured while the human toll continues to mount. Within days, the waters from the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, joined by the collapsed Rosaires and Sennar dams in Sudan, would surge northward along the Nile toward Egypt. The Aswan High Dam, Egypt's last major line of defense, would face unprecedented pressure. Although it is a colossal structure, it was never designed to withstand a sudden, massive pulse of water originating from hundreds of kilometers upstream. Emergency releases from its spillways would be necessary to prevent structural failure, but these measures would only shift the disaster downstream. Cities along the Nile, including Luxor, Aswan, and Kena, would experience severe flooding. Streets, homes, and farmlands could be submerged under several meters of water, displacing millions of residents. Agricultural infrastructure that sustains much of Egypt's food supply would be destroyed or rendered unusable. The inundation of croplands would also lead to soil degradation and the loss of planting cycles, causing long-term food insecurity. The humanitarian impact would be catastrophic. Millions would require immediate evacuation, shelter, and medical attention, with the spread of waterborne diseases such as cholera becoming a severe threat. Access to clean drinking water and sanitation would collapse in affected areas, compounding the public health crisis. Meanwhile, transportation networks along the Nile would be rendered impassable, slowing relief efforts and preventing efficient distribution of aid. Economically, Egypt would face crippling losses. The flooding would destroy homes, businesses, and essential infrastructure, potentially setting back development by decades. Insurance systems and government emergency funds would be overwhelmed, while the international community would be called upon for both financial and logistical support. The cascading disaster would also have geopolitical consequences. Tensions between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia would escalate as each nation seeks to protect its population while assigning blame for the devastation. International mediation would be essential, yet complex, as the scale of destruction makes cooperative solutions increasingly difficult. By the end of the first week, the initial floodwaters would have reshaped the Nile Valley in both Sudan and Egypt. Entire communities would be displaced, fertile lands submerged, and the very fabric of regional stability shaken. The GERD, intended as a symbol of progress, would instead stand as a monument to the immense risks inherent in massive infrastructure projects. In the months following the dam collapse, the scale of destruction across Northeast Africa becomes painfully clear. In Sudan, the devastation of the Gezira Plain has destroyed nearly 40% of the nation's agricultural land, leaving millions at risk of famine. Displaced populations crowd into makeshift camps along higher ground, struggling with limited food, shelter, and sanitation. Outbreaks of waterborne diseases such as cholera and dysentery spread rapidly, overwhelming the already strained healthcare system. Egypt faces long-term consequences as well. Emergency releases from the Aswan High Dam would have caused severe soil erosion and degradation of farmland along the Nile, diminishing crop yields for multiple growing seasons. Cities like Luxor and Aswan would face months of cleanup and reconstruction, with damaged infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and ports limiting economic recovery. The disruption to irrigation networks would further exacerbate the agricultural crisis, leaving millions dependent on food aid. Environmental damage is profound. Fish populations and river ecosystems are decimated, and sediment displacement alters the natural course of the Nile. Wetlands and riparian zones along the river suffer catastrophic habitat loss, affecting countless species. In some areas, chemical pollutants and debris left behind by the floods contaminate soil and water for years, threatening both human and ecological health. Politically, the disaster reshapes regional relationships. Ethiopia's reputation suffers as the GERD, once a symbol of national pride, becomes a source of international conflict. Sudan and Egypt demand accountability, and diplomatic tensions intensify. Efforts to rebuild trust and negotiate water-sharing agreements are slow and fraught with mistrust. The economic cost is staggering. Billions of dollars are lost in infrastructure, agriculture, and property, and the region's development is set back decades. International aid is essential, but logistical challenges and political disputes slow the delivery of relief. Communities must rely heavily on local resources and ingenuity to survive. For the people who survive, life is transformed. Urban centers along the Nile are partially abandoned, while rural areas struggle to recover. Basic services like electricity, healthcare, and clean water are limited or absent. Social structures are tested, and new systems of local governance and community cooperation emerge out of necessity. The dam's failure leaves a permanent scar on Northeast Africa. The Blue Nile's course, local topography, and regional ecosystems are forever changed. What was intended as a symbol of progress and prosperity becomes a stark lesson in the risks of massive infrastructure projects. Ultimately, the collapse of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam serves as a reminder of the delicate balance between human ambition and nature's forces. It shows how one catastrophic failure can ripple across borders, devastate populations, and alter the course of history. In the wake of the disaster, the region is forced to confront the limits of control, resilience, and cooperation. Picture this: the year is 2075 and the world is waking up to a crisis far greater than any oil shortage. Water, the most essential resource for life, has become the new currency of power. Nations that once shared rivers and lakes now watch upstream neighbors like hawks, wary of every dam, reservoir, or diversion. The struggle for water is no longer a distant worry. It is a daily reality for billions. The roots of these conflicts trace back decades. Climate change is altering the global water cycle, causing extreme droughts in some regions and catastrophic flooding in others. Glaciers in the Himalayas, the water towers of Asia, are shrinking at an unprecedented rate, threatening the rivers that supply over 1 billion people. Meanwhile, population growth continues at an astonishing pace, with the global population projected to reach nearly 10 billion by the middle of the century. More people means more water, is needed for drinking, agriculture, and industry. Agriculture alone consumes around 70% of all fresh water, making it the largest single driver of demand. On top of this, geopolitics is adding fuel to the fire. Over 3 billion people rely on water that crosses national borders. When an upstream country builds a dam or diverts a river, it gains a powerful lever over downstream neighbors. These shared resources are now high-stakes instruments of political and economic influence. Small disagreements over water allocation have the potential to escalate into regional crises, turning rivers into flashpoints for tension and instability. By 2075, these pressures are set to converge, creating the perfect storm for conflicts over water that could reshape international relations entirely. Our timeline of water conflicts begins on the banks of the world's longest river, the Nile. For thousands of years, Egypt has depended on the Nile for over 90% of its fresh water. It is not just a resource, it is a lifeline, woven into the nation's culture, agriculture, and survival. But by 2075, this vital artery is under unprecedented pressure. The flashpoint is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD. Ethiopia inaugurated the dam in September of 2025, Africa's largest hydroelectric project. For Ethiopia, it is a symbol of national progress designed to double the country's electricity output and lift millions out of poverty. Yet for Egypt, the dam represents an existential threat. Its reservoir allows Ethiopia to control the flow of the Blue Nile, a crucial source of water during increasingly frequent droughts. Sudan, positioned between the two nations, faces its own challenges, balancing potential benefits from regulated floods against the risk of being caught in the middle of escalating tensions. As the climate warms, the Nile's seasonal patterns are becoming unpredictable. Years of drought could leave Egypt and Sudan at the mercy of upstream decisions, while intense rains could overflow reservoirs and cause catastrophic flooding. Diplomatic negotiations have stalled, with Egypt appealing to international bodies and Ethiopia insisting on its sovereign right to use the river. By 2075, this standoff is a clear illustration of how shared water resources can turn into geopolitical tinder, a single flashpoint capable of sparking a broader regional crisis. From the Nile, we turn to South Asia, where water conflicts intersect with some of the most dangerous military arsenals on the planet. The Indus River Basin, shared by nuclear-armed rivals India and Pakistan, has long been a delicate balance of cooperation and tension, but by 2075, that balance is fraying. The Indus Waters Treaty, signed in 1960, once provided a stable framework. India controls the 3 eastern rivers, while Pakistan depends on the 3 western rivers for over 80% of its agricultural water. However, decades of population growth, industrialization, and glacial retreat have pushed the basin to the brink. In April of 2025, India suspended key treaty provisions, citing national security concerns after regional escalation in Kashmir. By withholding critical data on river flows and flood forecasts, India gained leverage that could dramatically affect Pakistan's water supply. The consequences are severe. With millions depending on irrigation and drinking water, even short-term reductions in river flow could spark famine, mass migrations, and internal unrest. Both nations now face a terrifying calculus. Any misstep could trigger direct conflict. In this future scenario, water is no longer merely a resource. It's a potential weapon, capable of shaping the geopolitics of the 21st century and beyond. The Indus Basin exemplifies how scarcity, climate change, and nuclear-armed neighbors combine into a volatile and high-stakes risk. While South Asia faces nuclear-tinged water tensions, other regions show how upstream control can become a tool of geopolitical dominance. In Southeast Asia, the Mekong River stretches over 4,000 kilometers, flowing through China, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. By 2075, China's upstream position has allowed it to construct at least 11 massive dams, controlling the flow to downstream nations. These dams not only generate electricity, but also dictate water availability, impacting agriculture, fisheries, and drinking supplies across multiple countries. Downstream nations like Cambodia and Vietnam have faced unprecedented droughts, while sudden water releases from the dams have caused destructive floods, illustrating the immense leverage held by the upstream state. In the Middle East, a similar dynamic unfolds along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which run through Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. Turkey's extensive dam-building projects upstream have reduced water flows to its neighbors by more than 50% in some areas. Agriculture has been devastated, and entire communities face displacement as fertile lands dry up. Some Iraqi officials warn that parts of the Euphrates could run nearly dry by 2040, intensifying competition over the remaining resources. These examples highlight how water scarcity, when combined with strategic infrastructure control, becomes a powerful weapon, reshaping regional politics and threatening stability across entire river basins. The stage is set, upstream nations hold the keys, and downstream populations live at their mercy. The final stage of this hypothetical scenario is where tensions turn explosive. Water scarcity alone doesn't automatically trigger war, but in the 21st century, the stakes are higher than ever. Upstream nations control dams and reservoirs, while downstream populations face dwindling supplies, failed crops, and mass migrations. When diplomacy stalls, economic measures often follow. Trade restrictions, sanctions, and threats that destabilize governments and create internal unrest. In some regions, the disruption reaches military levels. Attacks on water infrastructure, dams, pipelines, and treatment facilities become tools of coercion. A single strike can devastate a city's drinking supply or flood farmland, producing immediate humanitarian crises without ever firing a traditional weapon. In the most extreme cases, countries might mobilize troops along rivers, guarding strategic water points or seizing control of critical infrastructure. By 2075, such scenarios could affect billions, with conflicts flaring from Africa to South Asia, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. The consequences are global. Forced migrations increase, economies shrink, and international alliances are tested. While open war over water may be less common than forced cooperation, experts agree scarcity heightens the risk of both cross-border and internal violence. The rivers that sustain life may define the borders of tomorrow's conflicts, and the question for humanity becomes not if, but where the first major water confrontation will erupt. Day one begins not with chaos, but with silence. The morning sprinklers do not turn on. The dishwasher does not start. The shower sputters and coughs before running dry. You turn the tap once, then again harder, but no water comes out. Across the country, in apartments, houses, and offices, millions of people are discovering the exact same thing. From New York City to Iowa's farmlands to the suburbs of California, every faucet and every well has gone dry. At first, the reaction is confusion. Most people assume it is a local outage, maybe a burst pipe or a broken main. Calls pour into water departments, but the lines are jammed or disconnected. On social media, people start sharing updates. Hashtags trend in New York and Los Angeles, and disbelief spreads when it becomes clear this is not just a citywide issue, it is everywhere. Reports show empty canyons where the Colorado River should be. The Mississippi has turned into a trickle of mud. Even the Great Lakes, which normally hold about 1/5 of the world's fresh surface water, appear as barren craters. By the third hour, panic begins. Supermarkets are raided as bottled water flies off the shelves. People grab anything liquid they can, juice, soda, even milk. Small fights break out in the aisles, and some stores lock their doors to stop the chaos. The price of a single bottle of water jumps from $1 to $50 or even $100, a cost only a few can pay. For everyone else, thirst has already become a looming threat. By the 8th hour, America's systems start to fail. A fire in a Chicago restaurant spreads uncontrollably because hydrants are dry, and firefighters only have the water in their trucks. In Dallas, a life-saving surgery is canceled because sterilization equipment cannot be used. Hospitals, once safe havens, suddenly turn into dangerous places where sanitation is impossible. Then the power grid begins to collapse. Hydroelectric dams stop producing electricity almost immediately. Nuclear and fossil fuel plants, which need billions of gallons of water each day to cool their reactors and systems, shut down one by one. By the 15th hour, large parts of the country are without power, leaving cities in darkness. That night, the president declares a national emergency. FEMA and the National Guard are deployed, but the mission is impossible. How do you distribute a resource that no longer exists? Any hidden reserves are secured by the military, but for the public, there is nothing to give. In the blacked out cities, riots take over the streets. Looting spreads beyond supermarkets to pharmacies and hardware stores. Gunfire echoes in the night, and emergency vehicles are overwhelmed. By the end of the first 24 hours, the United States has fallen into chaos. Order has already collapsed, and this is only the beginning. Day 2 dawns with a nation already on edge. The confusion of the first day has turned into raw fear as thirst begins to take hold. Headaches, dizziness, and dry mouths spread across the country. People line up outside closed grocery stores, desperate for even a single bottle of water. Families begin rationing what little they found the day before, while many have nothing left at all. You can go weeks without food, but only a few days without water. The countdown has already started. By the third day, the crisis expands beyond individuals and households. Farms collapse almost instantly. Livestock begin dying in staggering numbers, from cattle in Texas to chickens in Arkansas and hogs in North Carolina. Entire herds are found lying lifeless in the fields, victims of a thirst they cannot escape. The crops fare no better. Corn in Iowa and wheat in Kansas shrivel to dust. America's breadbasket, once the engine of global food exports, is reduced to barren fields within 72 hours. This agricultural collapse reveals the hidden truth about modern consumption. Everything has a water cost. A pound of beef requires thousands of gallons to produce. Even a single cotton t-shirt represents hundreds of gallons. Without water, production of food and goods ends overnight. It's not just farming that has stopped, it is the entire foundation of the economy. By the fourth day, the financial markets implode. The New York Stock Exchange closes its doors, unable to operate in a country where industry itself no longer functions. Manufacturing halts as car factories, steel plants, and chemical facilities all go silent without cooling water. High-tech industries like semiconductor plants collapse immediately, their delicate processes destroyed without precise water supplies. The value of the American dollar plunges on the global stage, sparking panic far beyond US borders. As the first week progresses, the public health crisis becomes impossible to ignore. With sewage systems broken and trash piling up, outbreaks of disease begin spreading. Cholera emerges in southern cities where sanitation is already fragile. Dysentery sweeps through crowded shelters where families have fled. Hospitals, already powerless without sterilization, become breeding grounds for infection. Tens of thousands fall sick and there is no treatment. By the seventh day, America is unrecognizable. Neighborhoods turn into barricaded strongholds as people guard whatever supplies they have left. Streets are patrolled by desperate groups searching for liquid of any kind. The National Guard is stretched beyond breaking, no longer able to provide aid but only containment. The social fabric of the nation tears apart in a single week. America has become a land of survival, ruled not by law but by thirst. By the third week, desperation turns into migration. Millions leave their homes in the cities and towns, setting out on foot toward places they believe might still hold water. The highways, once filled with cars, are now crowded with endless streams of people walking. They carry backpacks, push shopping carts, or drag suitcases, but what they carry is far less important than what they are searching for. The dream is simple: reach the oceans or the Great Lakes where water once seemed endless. But the journey itself becomes a death march. With no food and no water along the way, entire families collapse on the hot pavement. The elderly and the young are the first to fall, leaving behind haunting trails of abandoned belongings on the road. The migration becomes one of the largest humanitarian crises in history, a mass movement of people with almost nowhere to go and nothing to find when they arrive. Inside hidden government facilities, desperate plans take shape. From bunkers deep underground, officials order the construction of desalination plants along the coasts, guarded by soldiers and declared critical to survival. The hope is to turn seawater into fresh water quickly enough to sustain millions. But desalination requires massive amounts of power, and with most of the grid already dark, progress is agonizingly slow. Even if a plant is completed, it produces only a fraction of the water Americans once used daily. In this vacuum of power, a new kind of ruler rises: the water barons. These are not elected officials, but individuals or groups who seized whatever reserves remained. A rancher with a secret well, a gang that took over a bottling warehouse, or a wealthy family that stockpiled underground tanks, all of them now hold absolute authority over anyone desperate enough to trade for a drink. In this new America, water has replaced money as the only true currency. The environment itself begins to unravel. With rivers gone and lakes reduced to dust, natural weather cycles break down. Clouds no longer form, and rain becomes a memory. Across the West, dry forests ignite into massive wildfires that rage unchecked. Wildlife vanishes, ecosystems collapse, and entire regions of the country are transformed into lifeless deserts. By the end of the month, the nation has fractured into a patchwork of isolated groups, fortified towns, wandering bands, and coastal enclaves under martial law. Communication has broken down, and there is no longer a sense of a single United States. What once was a modern superpower has, in just 30 days, collapsed into a primitive struggle for survival. A full year passes, and what remains of America barely resembles the country it once was. The population has plummeted, with tens of millions gone to thirst, disease, or starvation. What began as chaos has hardened into a brutal new normal. Survival is no longer about temporary fixes or waiting for rescue. It's about adapting to a world where water is rarer than gold. The coasts become the last bastions of organized life. Around a handful of desalination plants, walled cities rise. Places like San Diego and Charleston turn into fortress states, run under strict military law. Life inside is regimented to the milliliter. Every drop of water is measured and accounted for, rationed with absolute precision. Breaking the water laws is the gravest crime, punished not with prison but with exile into the wastelands. These coastal enclaves are both havens and prisons, where survival comes at the cost of freedom. Outside these guarded cities, the interior has become the drylands. Vast regions from the Great Plains to the Midwest are now lawless deserts, littered with the skeletons of once great cities. Chicago, St. Louis, and countless others stand as silent ruins, their skyscrapers rising above sand-filled streets. Nomadic bands roam these territories, surviving off scavenged cans of food and the faint hope of stumbling across a hidden spring. For them, the world before water vanished is already fading into myth. Inside the fortress cities, scientists labored desperately on long-shot solutions. They drilled deep into the Earth's crust, searching for untouched aquifers hidden miles below. Others experiment with pulling moisture directly from the air, building towering atmospheric water generators. Progress is painfully slow, and resources are thin, but research continues because hope is the only thing left to cling to. A generation of children grows up in this world, knowing nothing of rivers, lakes, or rainfall. To them, stories of swimming pools, water parks, and summer rainstorms sound like fairy tales. They live in a world where water doesn't fall freely from the sky. It is manufactured, guarded, and rationed like treasure. Their reality is shaped by scarcity, and their imaginations cannot even picture abundance. 1 year after the taps went dry, America exists in fragments, a collection of fortress states on the edges of a continent surrounded by deserts where millions struggle to survive. The global order has shifted, and the once dominant superpower has been reduced to a land haunted by thirst. By the 5th year of the crisis, the United States is unrecognizable. The old federal government is gone, fractured under the weight of collapse. What remains is a patchwork of regional powers, each defined by its access, or lack of access, to water. The once seamless idea of a united nation has broken into competing territories. The coastal fortress states thrive behind their walls, their survival owed to desalination and strict control. They trade carefully with international allies, offering technology and military protection in exchange for food and supplies. But their reach ends at the wastelands, where the majority of Americans still suffer. Between the fortified cities and the lawless dry lands lies a no-man's land patrolled by militias, smugglers, and raiders who sell stolen water for impossible prices. In the dry lands, a harsh new culture emerges. Communities that survive are not built around wealth or ideology, but around access to wells, aquifers, or captured rainfall. These water sources are defended with ferocity, and disputes are settled with violence more often than words. Former highways have become migration routes, where desperate caravans wander in search of rumored springs that rarely exist. The international stage shifts dramatically. Nations with abundant water, like Canada, Brazil, and parts of Africa, rise in influence. Shipments of bottled water cross oceans, but they reach only a privileged few. For the rest of the American population, outside aid is a whisper, too little to change the reality of mass thirst. The once global superpower has become a dependent client, reliant on the charity and conditions of others. Social life erodes further. Education collapses in most regions, replaced by survival training. Schools are abandoned, hospitals stripped for supplies, and the arts reduced to faint memories. People trade not in money, but in water, food, and information. A gallon of clean water is worth more than gold ever was, and the very idea of luxury has been rewritten. By now, the population is hardened, but exhaustion grows. For those who remember the time before, the thirst is not just physical, it is emotional. The memory of flowing rivers, summer rains, and cool glasses of water haunts them more than the dryness itself. For For the young, there is no memory of that world. Their America is dust, steel walls, and the endless search for a drink. 5 years into the waterless future, the nation is split between the few who control water and the many who are left to wander. It is not only a struggle for survival, it is the slow rewriting of what it means to be American. A decade into this relentless crisis, the United States is transformed into a continent of extremes. The coastal fortress states remain the last bastions of organized civilization. Inside their walls, life is highly regimented. Every drop of water is tracked, rationed, and recycled. People move in shifts to conserve energy and reduce evaporation, and strict penalties are enforced for any misuse. Outside, the dry lands stretch endlessly, a vast expanse of dust, ruins, and the skeletal remains of cities that once thrived. By now, the natural environment has been irrevocably altered. Forests have been reduced to tinder, rivers are mere cracked beds, and wetlands have disappeared completely. Wildlife has either vanished or adapted into small, scattered pockets near the few remaining water sources. Birds no longer migrate in their millions, and fish are extinct in most American rivers. The ecosystem has collapsed, leaving a silent, barren landscape that mirrors the struggle of humanity itself. Communities in the drylands have learned to survive in primitive ways. Rainwater collection, digging for hidden aquifers, and capturing morning dew are daily necessities. Nomadic tribes traverse the continent in search of these scarce resources, often encountering hostile groups that guard water with lethal efficiency. Survival has become a brutal, unending calculation, and trust is a rare commodity. Meanwhile, technology exists only in fragments. Some desalination plants continue to function, powered by generators and scarce fuel. Scientists and engineers operate under extreme conditions, constantly trying to innovate ways to stretch every drop. Atmospheric water harvesting is still experimental, and large-scale irrigation is a distant dream. The balance of power is entirely dictated by control over technology that can produce water, and the people who control it hold near absolute authority. The psychological impact is profound. Entire generations have grown up without ever touching a river, swimming in a lake, or drinking freely from a tap. Memories of water are stories told by elders, almost mythic in nature. People have developed rituals and habits around water that dictate every aspect of life, from hygiene to food preparation to social interactions. Water has become more than a resource. It is the foundation of culture, governance, and identity. Globally, the absence of the United States as a reliable consumer reshapes trade, diplomacy, and military strategy. New superpowers re-emerge in water-rich regions, and former allies now compete to provide aid or extract resources from the remaining pockets of American civilization. The world has adapted, but the scars of the crisis remain as a warning. A powerful nation can collapse almost overnight if it underestimates the value of its most fundamental resource. In the end, the story of America without water is a cautionary tale. It demonstrates not just the fragility of infrastructure and society, but the profound interconnectedness of natural resources, human civilization, and survival. It is a stark reminder that water is not infinite, that scarcity can arrive faster than anticipated, and that preparation, conservation, and foresight are the only shields against a world where the tap might run dry. August 20th, 1910 didn't appear out of nowhere. The stage for one of the worst fires in American history had been set months before. The winter of 1909 had been unusually mild, melting snow early and leaving the northern Rockies, stretching across Idaho, Montana, and Washington, unusually dry. By spring, rivers that normally swelled with snowmelt were reduced to trickles, and by June, the forests were tinder dry. Lightning from dry thunderstorms ignited hundreds of small fires, while sparks from trains, campfires, and logging operations added countless more. The United States Forest Service, created just 5 years earlier in 1905, was still a fledgling organization. Underfunded, understaffed, and largely inexperienced in handling fires of this scale, the agency scrambled to respond. Recruitment posters called for men who could ride for days, fight fires, and survive in the wilderness without losing their heads, a job for the toughest of men. By mid-August, estimates suggest between 1,000 and 3,000 separate fires were smoldering across the region, creating a patchwork of danger too vast for any single team to contain. Smoke thickened the air, the sun glowed dim and red through the haze, and the mountains seemed to hold their breath, waiting for disaster to strike. President William Howard Taft even sent 4,000 soldiers to help combat the flames. but it was like trying to put out an ocean with a bucket. The summer of 1910 was a perfect storm of human activity, extreme dryness, and natural lightning strikes. The forests of the northern Rockies were primed, waiting for the spark that would ignite one of the deadliest wildfires in United States history. Saturday, August 20th, 1910 brought the disaster that everyone had feared but could not stop. A powerful cold front swept into the northern Rockies, but instead of rain, it brought hurricane-force winds with gusts over 70 miles per hour. These winds turned the thousands of small fires into a single, unstoppable inferno, later known as the Big Blow-Up. Flames flattened and raced across the forest floor, while massive trees were uprooted and tossed like matchsticks. The fire created its own weather, sending superheated air spiraling and launching embers miles ahead, igniting new fires that trapped entire crews in seconds. The roar of the firestorm was described by survivors as a sound like 1,000 freight trains, drowning out all thought. Firefighters were caught in a desperate race for survival, with the flames moving faster than a galloping horse. One of the deadliest moments occurred at Setzer Creek, where 28 men in a firefighting crew were overrun and killed in the chaos. Passenger trains scrambled to evacuate towns in the path of the fire. One train carrying 1,000 residents of Avery, Idaho, raced over a bridge surrounded by flames, barely reaching safety through a nearby tunnel. Amid the chaos, Forest Ranger Ed Pulaski became a symbol of courage. Leading 44 men who were trapped in the inferno, he guided them to an old mine shaft. As the fire raged over the entrance, Pulaski used his revolver and quick thinking to maintain order, ensuring that 40 of the 45 men survived. His actions demonstrated extraordinary bravery in a firestorm that moved faster than any human could run, saving lives that would otherwise have been lost in the blaze. After 2 days of relentless destruction, rain finally arrived on August 23, 1910, bringing the inferno to an end. The devastation was staggering. At least 87 people had perished, 78 of them firefighters, and over 3 million acres of forest were incinerated, an area larger than the state of Connecticut. Entire towns had been wiped from the map, and the economic loss, adjusted for today's value, would exceed $1 billion. The smoke traveled thousands of kilometers, darkening skies as far away as New England and leaving soot on ice in Greenland. The fire's impact went far beyond immediate destruction. It transformed the United States Forest Service, proving the necessity of a professional and well-funded firefighting organization. Public attention turned to the heroism of men like Ed Pulaski, and Congress responded by doubling the Forest Service budget. A century-long policy of aggressive fire suppression began, creating a network of lookout towers, access roads, and elite firefighting teams, including the introduction of smoke jumpers in later decades. Yet this policy had unintended consequences. By suppressing natural low-intensity fires for decades, forests became unnaturally dense, allowing dead wood and underbrush to accumulate. This fuel buildup made future fires even more destructive, setting the stage for modern megafires. Smokey Bear, created in 1944, embodied the philosophy of total fire prevention, spreading a message that shaped American attitudes toward forest management for generations. The Great Fire of 1910 was more than a disaster, it was a turning point. It highlighted the raw power of nature and the limits of human control, while forcing a nation to rethink its approach to forest safety, preparedness, and firefighting. The Great Fire of 1910 was a crucible that reshaped both the landscape and the nation's approach to wildfire. In its aftermath, survivors, officials, and communities faced years of rebuilding. Entire towns had been destroyed, and the northern Rockies forests were left scarred and vulnerable. Recovery was slow, with displaced families forced to find new livelihoods, while the U.S. Forest Service struggled to restore the burned areas and prevent soil erosion. The fire also cemented Ed Pulaski's legacy. His leadership during the inferno became a symbol of courage under impossible circumstances, and his invention of the Pulaski tool, a combination of an axe and a hoe, revolutionized firefighting. Pulaski's story inspired generations of firefighters to prepare for disasters with discipline, strategy, and respect for nature's power. The lessons learned from the fire guided future forest management for decades. Policies were implemented to monitor fire-prone areas, train specialized crews, and invest in early warning systems. However, the fire also illustrated the unintended consequences of aggressive suppression, showing how overmanaged forests could store massive amounts of fuel and become tinderboxes for future megafires. Even today, the events of August 20th to 23rd, 1910 echo through the American West. The Great Fire serves as a stark reminder of nature's unpredictability, the limits of human control, and the need to balance prevention with ecological understanding. It stands as one of the deadliest and most transformative wildfires in history, leaving a legacy of heroism, tragedy, and crucial lessons for modern firefighting and forest management.